Hi there, this is Carl Irwin, and we're going to be taking a look at the LSP Impulse Reverb stereo plugin. That's Linux Studio plugins, and if you're not a Linux audio user, if you don't create your material on the Linux platform and you're not using the LSP plugins, that's fine. This is then just a look at a convolution reverb, and a lot of what we're going to talk about here can be applied to other convolution reverbs. But we're going to highlight this one to give a little bit more attention to these very solid plugins that are part of this suite, the LSP plugins. So this is a convolution reverb. It uses impulse responses. Impulse response files are actually wave files that are recorded from a real environment, and they contain information that models the reverb effect of that environment. We're going to talk about how to create those in a moment here. I'll explain ways that you can do it that are very simple. We'll talk about a way to do it acoustically in real environments. We'll also talk about ways to do it digitally using other algorithmic reverbs. Why would you want to do that? Well, impulse response reverbs inside of a convolution plugin, reverb plugin, they do respond differently. They sound different. They tend to have a little bit more of a gritty kind of real world sort of quality to them. Whereas algorithmic reverbs, while they sound very, very polished, they almost sound too polished sometimes. So one thing that people like to do with convolution reverbs is that they will use them for buses. They'll place them onto a bus where you have certain instruments coming into, and you just want to apply a little bit of a reverb just to that one bus, and then down chain, when you get down to the final mix, you would apply some other kind of reverb, maybe an algorithmic one that would just kind of mix everything together and glue it all together. We'll look at an application that's very similar to that as well before we're done. So I have an example here. This is a flute etude that is actually an academic adjudication etude. I'm a public school teacher in New York State, and our students, for their county adjudications, they play all the same from the same suite of solos. So this is a solo for the high school students. I compose the solos for our students in this area of New York State, and this is just an example of it, just to demonstrate the capability here. So listen carefully. Okay, so that's an example of the reverb. If we take a look at what's going on here, we actually have two impulse responses at work here. So the plugin has the option to load in up to 4 different impulse response files. I have 2 of them loaded. We'll talk about what they are. And then down here, you have the ability to route those to particular parts of the actual track that you're using. You can deal with very basic controls related to each of those channels. So I have one here on the left side, and then I have one here for the right side. But then over here I have a third iteration. The fourth one I did not use, but the third iteration, I'm using a separate impulse response. So I'm using the second impulse response that I have loaded in there from a different room. And I'm applying this dead center. So I'm using this in center pan for the entire track. And this is all arbitrary. I'm just doing this to show the functions. I think typically the way most people would probably use this is they would load in one impulse response, they would apply it to a track in stereo, and that would be it. but you can come up with fairly complex mixes here with the plugin controls that are provided. So that's the sound with it, and if we turn it off, we disable it here, you can hear what it sounds like without. So very dry, very, very dry. And adding this reverb really does place this into a room. Now, when you think of reverb, you tend to probably think of kind of long tail decay. But reverb can accomplish so much more than that. And this is a good use for convolution reverb, is just to place elements into space. It might not be a very deep space. It might not be a very cavernous space. Certainly you could do that. But convolution impulse response reverb is really great for just putting instruments into the same room, particularly if you have some samples that might be coming from different locations, or you have people that have recorded in different spaces and you're trying to get them to come together. Hopefully the recordings are fairly dry and they're easier to mix that way. You can also try to mimic pre-existing reverb that someone might have from a particular space, and you can apply an impulse response that is similar to the space that they recorded in, and that will also help to kind of blend everything together. So that's the typical use. Let's look at some controls. We already looked at the ability to add multiple impulse responses, and we also talked about how you can route them, but there's also an equalizer down here. So you can boost signals that are of interest, and you can also decrease signals that might be creating mud or undesirable outcomes from your impulse response. So you have some control over that. There is the ability to do some cutting at the top and the bottom. If you choose to do that. There's a dry signal. There's also a wet signal as well. Now, the way I tend to use this, and we'll try something here, I'm going to reset this. If I completely reset the plugin, and we'll bring up our equalizer so that we can use that if we choose. I'm going to load in one impulse response. So I'm just going to select here. We'll go to another impulse response. I'm going to select a larger place. So we'll do this one here. And when I click on that, you can hear the sound. It sounds like a balloon popping or a gunshot sort of sound. That is a typical impulse response sound. And it will audition it when you click on it, and you can have it play back if you want to hear it again. Here's another one. So it's a little bit brighter. Here's another one. In fact, the impulse responses that I was using on the first example were these. One is from my bathroom, and this is from my dining room. You can see they're a little bit different. They're created by clapping. It's as simple as that. I set the microphone in one part of the room, and then I clap in the other part of the room, and you get a clap produces a sort of kind of a brief moment of white noise that has a wide spectrum of frequencies, and you can get the response from that. If you're actually going to do this for real in a very more legitimate way in your spaces, you would typically want to pop a balloon. That is the usual kind of method that people use to do quick impulse response gathering, is they'll take a party balloon, fill it up fairly full, and pop it. You set your mic where you want to pick up the sound. You take the balloon to this place where you want the source. You pop the balloon, and then you get the response. I have some other convolution reverb impulse responses that I've recorded in large spaces using a snare drum, and I just perform a rim shot, a really hard crack rim shot on the drum, and that can work too. Now, whatever sound source you do use will influence the impulse response a little bit, may create some need for equalization down the road when you go to apply it. But that is the essence of how you do it. Generate a quick burst of white noise, and then you can get your response. We'll look at how to do this digitally as well. Let's load one in. So I'm going to load in this one. This has a much bigger fall off, as you can see here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the wet value and drop it all the way down to 0 so that we don't blow everything out. And I'm going to assign this now to the tracks. You can do this a few different ways. We could merely apply this to the first one. You can see it's already in there, file 1 and track 1. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my pan, and I'm going to set it to center. So if I take this and I bring it up to my output up to center, and I'll do the same over here. I'll bring my output up to center. And then we will check this out and see what it sounds like. So if we play this back, as it plays, I'll increase my wet value. So you can see how you can dial this in. You increase the wet, you can pull back the dry a little bit to give it a little bit more depth in the space. In general, the less dry sound that you have, then the deeper in the space the source will start to sound. You can also control the overall output. And of course, there's equalization settings down here that I referenced before. Let's look at what it takes to make an impulse response. You can make some of these on your own. So I did explain the method, but we're going to look at a digital kind of creation. And to do that, we're going to open up Audacity. And the first thing you need is you need to have a sound source. Now, typically, like I said, you want to have some kind of a white noise generator. Balloon popping is a very, very good source for that. Some people that take this very seriously, that instead of using a white noise source, what's called a Dirac, D-I-R-A-C waveform, which is very similar to a balloon popping. It's a little bit more of a clippy sound. They will use a sine wave sweep. So it'll sweep a sine wave a little bit longer through the gamut of frequencies. And then what you do is you take that original sound, that sweeping sound, and you remove it from the recording, and then what you're left with is a profile. That is another way to do it. You can also cut off the sound of the sound wave sweep and then take everything after that, the reverberation in the room. That is another way to do it. So there's a number of ways to go about this. A couple of them are more complicated, but if you're just going to do the white noise method, you can do this digitally inside of Audacity. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create some white noise. So I'll go to Generate, click Noise, White Noise. I'm going to do 1 millisecond. Just 1 millisecond. It's very, very short. We'll generate. You can see how short this is. And what I'm going to do is out here, I'm going to generate some silence. So we'll go up here, we'll hit silence. I'll create about 6 seconds of silence. That should give us plenty of reverb. Typically, you want your reverb to be even that long. Then I'm going to join these two together. So I have my white noise clip, and then I've got my silence after that. And if we zoom out here, you can see it's hardly any noise. It's going to be a little blip. You can hear what it sounds like. There it is. So you can hear that little clip right at the beginning. Now what we're going to do is we're going to apply a reverb, an algorithmic reverb to this. So we'll select the whole thing. We'll just go to the onboard reverb. So we'll go to Effect, come down here to Delay and Reverb. We'll select Reverb, and we'll just select a preset. So let's go to Large Room. And there's some discussion about how you deal with this. If you're going to remove all the pre-delay, I just leave everything as is. But the one thing that you want to have is you want only the wet signal. We do not want to get any of the dry signal. We only want to get the wet response. That's all we want in our file. We could change the room size. We could change some of these parameters a little bit. Let's make the room a little bit smaller. We'll take it down to 70. And then we'll hit Apply. And we see that we have our reverb effect over here. Now it's really light, so I'm going to go to Normalize. We're going to normalize this out to 0. The other thing you'll notice if we zoom in, that we also have some space at the beginning, and that's not desirable. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut everything up to where the waveform begins. We'll delete. And what I like to do is I cut into it a little bit, and then I go to that first little bit of the waveform, and I like to, whenever I'm dealing with wave files like this, even with an impulse response, I like to put a fade in, just so that you have a zero crossing right at the beginning, and you don't get any undesirable artifacts. Now, the next thing we want to do is we're going to play this back. You'll hear how this sounds. It's going to sound very different now. I'm going to watch the meter over here. I want to see for the playback level to reach 0 and at what point on the timeline that happens, and then we'll cut back to that point. So it looks like just about right before maybe 1.5 seconds. So I'm going to cut back to here, and we'll delete, and we'll just check that out again. That seems about right. Maybe even a little bit deeper than that. Just about right. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the last little bit here, about half of it, and I'm going to add a fade. So we'll just fade that out. And then this is our impulse response. What we need to do is we'll save this. And by the way, this sounds an awful lot like clapping in a room. You can see why clap or balloon pop works very, very well for this kind of waveform creation. Let's export this. We'll export it to the desktop here. We'll call this room impulse response. We'll save it. And now we'll go back here, and I'm going to reset this again. And we'll load in our room impulse response. So here it is. This is the one we just made. And I'll bring the wet level down. And we'll set this output to 0 to center, input to center. We'll just use one track here. And as we play back, we'll increase the wet. Very effective. Very, very effective. Okay. Let's look at what this looks like in a large project. How would this look for a large project? So I have a project that's already open. This is just an orchestral project that I've used for examples before, and I've got drive iterations of the woodwinds, the brass, the percussion, the strings. These are already panned. Then I've got a sub bass down here. The sub bass is going to go straight to master. We're not going to apply any effects to this. But if we go to the mixer, what I put on here are 5 iterations of the LSP Impulse Reverb plugin. And this is the stereo reverb, the one we were just looking at. And this is what it sounds like without any reverb. Very dry, okay, very dry. So what I've done here is I have on each instrument track, I have an iteration of the reverb, but each one has a slightly modified instance of the same impulse response. So if you look here at the strings, I have it set to fairly low. The dry signal is at -1. The wet signal is at -60. A little bit of work here on the EQ to deal with frequencies that I wanted to get rid of and some that I wanted to hear more of. And then if you go up back into the ensemble, the virtual ensemble here, go to the woodwinds, and you see that I have this set to also -1 dry, but up to 50, -50 wet. So 10-point difference here. And then, of course, some edits on the EQ. And then if we go up from there to the brass section, I've got this to -1.5 dry, but I've got my wet set up to 45, -45, so a little higher. A little bit more editing down here in the EQ. And then the percussion, which would be in the very back, I have this one set to -40, but I return the dry down another half of a decibel. So, and then more editing down here in the EQ. So as you get further back in the ensemble, there's less dry and more wet. And what this does is it puts each section into space within a virtual room. So you have the same impulse response from the same room being applied, and this is one that I recorded from a real space. The real space is actually a rehearsal hall, so it's like a sound stage area. And what we're listening to then in the application of this reverb is that each section is a little deeper into the room from the mic source, and that should be the effect. So if we play this back now, we should hear that there's some realism to the spacing of the instruments, that the strings sound much more in the foreground, the brass percussion sound a little bit more in the background, more deep. Although they are very powerful and very full, they sound like they're projecting through the ensemble from a deeper area in the space. Now what I do is I bring all of this down to a mix bus. So this is I labeled this room mix, and I added another iteration of the LSP. Now you wouldn't necessarily do this. You might use a completely different reverb for the finished reverb, but because we're talking about the LSP plugin, I put another one here, and this is a different impulse response. This is from a hall. This is from a concert hall. And I created this one as well. This is actually in a performance space from about halfway back. The auditorium space, this was recorded in seats about 600. And so it's kind of a medium-sized space. It's about halfway into the depth of the auditorium. And the impulse response was recorded from center mid-stage. And this is what this sounds like. Again, I applied this, and then I did a little bit of EQ editing here to bring out the sounds I want and to push back on some of the undesirable artifacts from this particular impulse response. This is what we get. So you can get the idea there, how that works. Now, the one thing you'll note is that the effect is subtle. I think The best application of reverb, and particularly this kind of reverb, is to bring it up to a point where you notice it and then knock it back just a notch. Bring it up to where you notice the change and then knock it back a little bit. If you're going to take the dry down, take the dry back until you notice that it's missing and then bring it back in just a little bit. That's probably good policy for almost any plugin whenever you're altering settings. Move the setting until you notice it and then move it back just a little bit. And it creates a very subtle addition of space and environment to what is otherwise absolutely dry, an absolutely dry performance. So that is the LSP Impulse Response plugin. Impulse Reverb plugin. Hopefully you learned something about convolution reverb, impulse response, learned a little bit about how to make these in a real environment or also in a virtual digital environment. And by the way, you can make an impulse response using an array of plugins if you're going to do it digitally. You could stack up a rack or a chain of various plugins. It might be multiple types of reverb, might be equalization and compression and all kinds of different sorts of effects. And from that, generate an impulse response. And you get some very interesting results from that. Likewise, you can use just any kind of wave source and get very interesting results. So you could use a convolution reverb not specifically for reverb, but maybe as an effect, where you bring in some other kind of waveform that's not an impulse response, load it in, and then see what it does. See what it does to your sound. How does it alter it? Does it create a sort of sampled synthesized effect? There's a lot to be said for that as well. So anyway, in the future, we'll look at the Room Builder. That is the Impulse Reverb plugin, the stereo iteration of it for LSP. Hopefully you enjoyed this and get out there, go make some impulse responses and add some reverb to your projects. Good luck with this. Happy mixing.